You're going to want to wear full PPE, disposable coveralls, a full face respirator, gloves. I put my camera and my moisture meter inside a large Ziploc bag to keep them clean as possible when I'm going into an attic or crawl space. And also in the bag are supplies to collect surface samples if I see something that looks like mold. A roll of clear tape, a few smaller sandwich bags to put the tape lift samples in, a magic marker to write on the outside of the sandwich bags where I collected surface samples of what I thought was mold. And the procedure on how to do this is covered in How to Test Visible Mold. Attic checklist. Peek your head inside an attic and look for mold on lumber. Generally, to do a good job, though, you're going to have to suit up and walk the whole space. If you're in a cold climate, one that even gets cold half of the year, you're going to check for fiberglass insulation stuffed into the side where the walls meet the roof, the soffits. Builders think this is a good idea to keep air out of the attic. It's a bad idea because then air can't get out of the attic, it can't get ventilated, it can't stay like outside air. Humidity builds up, mold grows in those pockets. If you see evidence of leaks around the roof, pipe vents, you want to check for mold and water damage where the pipe goes through the ceiling of the occupied space. So here's a picture of mold spotting in an attic on the roof decking. This is Alternaria. Alternaria and Cladosporium are very common in attics and in crawl spaces on the wood because those are the first molds that grow when there's condensation. Meaning, see the way it's spotting? The whole roof didn't get wet from the outside from a roof leak. Something made it get moist inside the attic, humid. And then in the wintertime, and typically sometimes this might just be on the north-facing side of the house, where snow builds up or it just stays colder, doesn't see the sun as much. The roof on that side is colder. Each of those little spots is where it got just cold enough for condensation to start occurring. In Cladosporium and Alternaria, the first molds you'll see grow with condensation because they can grow with less moisture requirement and in shorter periods of time than the other molds like Stachybotrys. You also find Aspergillus penicillin on wood. Another picture of an attic, and you can see how night and day one side is versus the other, not from a roof leak, but from condensation. One side was cold, the other got sunlight. And here's a picture where the condensation happened because a leaky dryer duct. The dryer was blowing humid air on the bottom of the roof. If you see that there looks like a vent pipe leak, pull back the insulation. In this case, it's the blown-in fiberglass. And look for where it got wet. Mold needs water. And this next slide, you see where there's actually the black mold growing on the ceiling of the occupied space. That's drywall. Now, that is not a lot of mold. Ultimate solution, unfortunately, is you have to cut the drywall out, which would mean cutting out the drywall from the inside, making a big mess. Here's another picture of mold on the ceiling from water leaking in on the roof. You have to pull the insulation back to see that. Mold, by the way, cannot grow on cellulose insulation. That's the stuff made with newspapers. It took me probably a year or two to realize this because for the first year or two, I was trained, taught, told that it could. When the blown-in cellulose gets wet, it forms clods like wet newspaper clumped together. Some of it looks dirty because it's in a dirty space. Attic's not clean. Dust, the wind blows through there. I couldn't find mold. Conclude there's mold. And then I realized, well, why is that? Cellulose is newspaper, recycled or sometimes brand new. When they make cellulose insulation with the newspapers, they treat it with boric acid as a fire retardant. Ironically, boric acid also works very well as a fungal anti-mold agent. It inhibits the enzyme activity of the mold, so it can't grow mold. It also does the same for insects. So now it prevents termites and insects from eating the insulation, and whether it was intended or not, mold can't grow on it. Where are you going to find mold if you do? It's on the lumber, the joist, the framing, the bottom of the roof decking, and then sometimes on the ceiling. Could also be on the paper backing of fiberglass batt insulation if the paper got wet enough. Most common thing is probably to find mold that's pre-existing. I mean, you go up in an attic and you see one or two or half your attic, the wood framing, the joists are moldy, and the other half are not. What happened is those wood members were installed wet. They likely laid outside in the rain before they were actually installed. The source of moisture is not your attic. Your attic is not the problem. But now you have moldy joist. Unfortunately, it's the same as whether it was an active roof leak or not. You fix the source of moisture, in this case there isn't anyone anymore. Remove the mold, which in the case of wood is by mechanical means, wire brushing or sanding. It's a big job. Typically nowadays, most mold remediators, even though they're paid a lot, they don't seem to be able to do that kind of work, that kind of level of detailed work. Therefore, you resort to encapsulation, meaning using a product made to cover mold. Sometimes it's not really a health hazard. Sometimes what looks really bad and dark and spooky is mostly staining and not actual fuzz and growth, meaning there aren't any spores. If you test the wood with a tape lift, in a situation like that, I would arbitrarily take a few tape lifts from the worst wood I think possible, from what's average, and something from what's like barely staining, barely looks like mold, just to get an idea. How bad is it? Is there fuzz everywhere, or is it barely detectable? It might come back to the lab 2 or 3 samples says no mold, even though it looks like mold. Or it might say mycelium fragments, meaning those are the roots of mold that started to grow when it was left outside in a pile wet in the rain before it was built with, but most of it's just staining. At the end of the day, sometimes it's kind of still difficult because I got some spots with mold, some not. I can't test every spot. What do? Gather enough information, then it becomes easier to make a decision. Sometimes to gather more information, you would take air samples. You would take an air sample in the attic, take at least 2 air samples in the occupied space, and you take an outside sample and compare them. And it might be, oh, I see mold in the house and mold in the attic, and it's in both places the same kind, and yeah, my attic's kind of needs to be cleaned up. And if it was that bad, I wouldn't say encapsulate, I would probably say rebuild. Not common, so don't be frightened. More likely you might find you can't detect the air in your living space that's in the attic on those 3 areas of mold. And then you might say, well, it's not worth $100,000 to rebuild my attic. But I might go up and with the wire brush, in my full PPE disposable coveralls, gloves, full face respirator, wire brush those places that look moldy, and then with plain soap and water and a pile of rags, so the rags don't go back in the soapy water. It's always a clean rag. After I wire brushed, I would damp wipe the wood to remove the dust, sawdust from my wire brushing. It only takes a few swipes of the wire brush. It's very effective. We've done that experiment and clean it up.